Don't wear mixed fabrics. Leviticus 19:19 contains a rule most Christians have never heard of, and it's sitting right there in plain text. Do not wear clothing made of two different materials. Specifically, the Bible bans mixing wool and linen, a combination the Hebrew tradition calls shatnez. This wasn't a minor footnote either. Deuteronomy 22:11 repeats it almost word for word. The reasoning scholars most commonly point to is that God wanted Israel to look visually distinct from surrounding pagan nations, whose priests wore mixed garments during rituals. Orthodox Judaism still enforces this today, with some communities paying certified inspectors to check their clothing before wearing it. Meanwhile, the average Christian is sitting in a polyester cotton blend shirt, completely unaware they'd be in violation of a law that appears in the same book of the Bible as rules they absolutely do know about. Don't eat shellfish. Leviticus 11:10 calls shellfish an abomination, not a suggestion to avoid, not a gentle recommendation. The Hebrew word used is sheketz, a strong term of disgust and prohibition, and it is the exact same word used elsewhere in Scripture for violations Christians treat as extremely serious. Shrimp, lobster, crab, clams, all explicitly covered. What makes this particularly striking is the severity of the language. The chapter goes into detail, specifying that anything in the water without fins and scales is detestable and should not be eaten. Some theologians point to Acts 10, where Peter has a vision of unclean animals being declared clean, as the moment dietary laws were lifted for Christians. But that interpretation is debated, and in the meantime, most Christians cheerfully eat shrimp cocktail at church fundraisers without a second thought. Don't touch a pig, even a dead one. The prohibition in Leviticus 11:7-8 goes further than most people realize. It is not just about eating pork. Touching the carcass of a pig made a person ritually unclean under Mosaic law, requiring ceremonial washing and waiting until evening before being considered pure again. The Hebrew concept here is tameh, ritual impurity, and it applied to physical contact, not just consumption. The pig is listed alongside camels, hyraxes, and hares as animals that are unclean to touch when dead. This means that ancient contact with a dead pig for any reason, including farming, hauling, or handling, triggered a full purification process. Most modern Christians who eat bacon at breakfast and handle raw pork while cooking are operating several violations deep into a law from the same Torah section that contains the Ten Commandments. Women must be silent in church. 1 Corinthians 14:34-35 contains one of the most debated and quietly ignored passages in the New Testament. Paul writes that women should be silent in churches, that they are not permitted to speak, and that if they want to learn something, they should ask their husbands at home. 1 Timothy 2:12 reinforces this, with Paul stating he does not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. These are not obscure Old Testament ceremonial laws. They appear in Paul's direct instructions to early Christian congregations. Many scholars argue these were culturally specific instructions addressing particular problems in Corinth, and some manuscripts suggest verses 34 and 35 may have been added later, though that remains contested. What is not contested is that most modern churches with female pastors, worship leaders, and public speakers are operating in direct tension with a plain reading of this text. Don't cut the sides of your beard. Leviticus 19:27 forbids marring the corners of your beard, which scholars widely interpret as trimming or shaping the edges of facial hair. The Hebrew word peah refers to the corner or edge, and the prohibition is connected to mourning rituals practiced by neighboring pagan nations who shaved specific parts of their beards as a sign of grief for the dead. God's instruction was to look different. Some Jewish communities still observe this today through payot, the long, uncut sidelocks visible on Orthodox men. The irony is hard to miss. Nearly every artistic depiction of Moses, Abraham, and the prophets shows neatly trimmed, shaped beards, the exact style this law was designed to prohibit. The rule sits directly next to the tattoo prohibition in the same verse, which gets enormous modern attention, while the beard rule gets almost none. Don't get tattoos. Leviticus 19:28 says, "Do not print any marks upon you," and this one has become a major flashpoint in modern Christian culture. The Hebrew word used is ka'aka, which is rare enough that scholars debate whether it referred specifically to mourning tattoos made in honor of the dead, which was a pagan practice at the time, or to body marking more broadly. What makes this fascinating is the selective application. Christians who cite this verse against tattoos are almost always sitting in the same chapter as the beard rule they ignore, having just eaten shellfish, wearing a cotton polyester blend. All three violations appear within a few verses of each other in Leviticus 19. The verse is real, the prohibition is clear, but the theological gymnastics required to apply it to a Christian cross tattoo, while ignoring everything around it in the same chapter, is, to put it gently, impressive. Don't charge interest on loans to fellow believers. Exodus 22:25, Leviticus 25:36 through 37, and Deuteronomy 23:19 all prohibit charging interest, in Hebrew, neshek, meaning literally a bite, on loans made to fellow Israelites, or in some interpretations, fellow believers. This is not a passing comment. It appears 3 separate times across the Torah. The medieval Catholic Church took this seriously enough to officially prohibit usury, which contributed directly to a situation where Jewish moneylenders, permitted by their own law to charge interest to non-Jews, became associated with banking, fueling centuries of anti-Semitic tropes. The modern Christian financial world, including explicitly Christian banks, mortgage lenders, and credit companies, operates entirely on interest. The rule that appears 3 times in Scripture, in the same collection of laws as commands Christians treat as foundational, is functionally invisible in contemporary Christian economic life. Greet each other with a holy kiss. Paul does not suggest this once. He commands it 4 separate times: Romans 16:16, 1 Corinthians 16:20, 2 Corinthians 13:12, and 1 Thessalonians 5:26. Peter adds a 5th instance in 1 Peter 5:14. 5 direct commands in the New Testament to greet one another with a holy kiss, making it one of the most repeated behavioral instructions in Paul's letters, appearing more times than many doctrinal statements Christians treat as non-negotiable. The early church practiced this as a formal liturgical greeting, and some Eastern Orthodox traditions still include a kiss of peace in their services. The modern Western Church replaced it with a handshake, a wave, or an awkward side hug. No theological council formally abolished it. It simply faded out, while other, far less repeated commands remained firmly in place. Sell everything you own and give to the poor. Matthew 19:21 records Jesus directly telling a man to sell all his possessions and give the money to the poor. Luke 12:33 extends this instruction beyond one individual, with Jesus telling his disciples broadly to sell their possessions and give to the poor. The early church in Acts 2:44 through 45 actually did this, selling property and distributing proceeds to anyone in need. Then Jesus adds the statement about a camel passing through the eye of a needle being easier than a rich man entering heaven. Most scholars believe this refers to a literal sewing needle, not a Jerusalem gate as popular legend claims. The prosperity gospel movement, which teaches that financial wealth is a sign of God's favor and blessing, exists in direct and explicit tension with some of the clearest economic instructions Jesus gave, recorded in multiple gospel accounts. Don't pray in public. Matthew 6:5-6 contains Jesus calling public prayer hypocritical. His exact framing is that those who pray standing in synagogues and on street corners to be seen by others have already received their reward in full. The instruction that follows is to go into your room, close the door, and pray to God in secret. What makes this particularly striking is the placement. The Lord's Prayer, the most widely recited prayer in Christianity, appears just 3 verses later in Matthew 6:9, meaning it was given explicitly as a model for private prayer, not public performance. Pre-game prayer circles, stadium invocations, grace said loudly at restaurants for visible effect, all fall within the behavior Jesus describes in this passage using the Greek word hypocrites, from which the English word hypocrite is directly derived. Don't swear oaths. Matthew 5:34-37 records Jesus saying, "Do not swear at all," specifically forbidding oaths by heaven, earth, Jerusalem, or one's own head. The command is to let your yes be yes and your no be no, with anything beyond that coming from the evil one. James 5:12 repeats this instruction almost word for word, giving it 2 New Testament witnesses. Quakers and Mennonites historically refused to take courtroom oaths based on this passage and faced legal persecution and imprisonment for it. The modern courtroom still places witnesses on a Bible and asks them to swear to tell the truth, which is structurally the exact scenario this verse prohibits. Most Christians swear oaths without hesitation, in courtrooms, in casual conversation, at weddings, in contracts, while treating this clear and doubly attested New Testament command as if it does not exist. Don't eat blood or strangled animals. Acts 15:20 and 15:29 record the Jerusalem Council, the closest thing the early church had to an official legal ruling, issuing 4 specific requirements for Gentile Christians. One of them was to abstain from blood and from strangled animals. This makes it more binding, not less, than most Old Testament dietary laws, since it was the new Christian leadership explicitly applying a rule to non-Jewish believers. Strangled animals retain their blood rather than being drained, which connects this to the broader biblical prohibition on consuming blood. A rare steak still contains blood by most culinary definitions. Black pudding and blood sausage are explicitly blood products. These are widely eaten by Christians who consider Levitical dietary laws abolished, apparently unaware that the Jerusalem Council of approximately 49 AD specifically kept this rule and directed it at them. Wives must submit, but husbands must die. Ephesians 5:22 is one of the most quoted verses in debates about Christian marriage. Wives, submit to your husbands. What almost never gets quoted is Ephesians 5:21, the verse immediately before it, which commands mutual submission between all believers, or Ephesians 5:25, 3 verses later, which commands husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Christ's love for the church, in Christian theology, meant dying for it. So the command placed on husbands is a willingness toward self-sacrifice, not authority. The Greek word hupotasso, used for submit, appears in a context of voluntary yielding, not forced hierarchy. The selective quotation of verse 22 without its surrounding context has shaped entire theological traditions and marital power structures, while the far more demanding command placed on husbands in verse 25 receives a fraction of the emphasis. Don't associate with greedy or slanderous Christians. 1 Corinthians 5:11 contains a rule that directly inverts how most churches operate. Paul says not to associate with anyone who calls themselves a Christian, but is greedy, a slanderer, a drunkard, or a swindler. He specifies not even to eat with such a person. What makes this remarkable is the distinction he draws. He explicitly says this does not apply to non-Christians who behave this way, only to self-identified believers. Most church culture does the reverse, treating outsiders with suspicion while extending endless grace to internal bad behavior. Paul places greed and slander on the same list as sexual immorality, making them equal offenses requiring the same response. A church that refuses to seat a greedy member at the fellowship table while welcoming the donation from a wealthy slanderer is operating in direct contradiction to this instruction. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Ephesians 4:26 gives a deadline. Resolve your anger before the day ends. This is not a piece of therapeutic advice or a poetic suggestion. The verse immediately following, Ephesians 4:27, states that unresolved anger gives the devil a foothold, framing delayed anger not as a personal failing, but as a spiritual vulnerability with active consequences. Matthew 6:15 reinforces the urgency from a different angle, with Jesus stating that if you do not forgive others, your own forgiveness is withheld. Together, these passages treat forgiveness not as an optional virtue, but as a condition. Christians who carry grudges for years, who stop speaking to family members for decades, who nurse resentment through long, cold silences, are not just failing emotionally. They are violating a specific, time-bound command with a specific, stated spiritual consequence attached to it. Honor the Sabbath completely. Exodus 28-10 is one of the 10 commandments, sitting in the same list as do not murder and do not steal. It commands a complete cessation of work on the seventh day, and Numbers 15:32-36 records a man being executed by stoning for gathering sticks on the Sabbath, demonstrating the severity with which it was originally enforced. The seventh day in the Hebrew calendar is Saturday. Most Christians worship on Sunday, a shift that traces historically to the Roman Emperor Constantine's edict of 321 AD, which designated Sunday as the official day of rest. Seventh-day Adventists are among the few Christian groups who still observe Saturday as the Sabbath based on this command. The rest of Christianity observes a different day with different rules, while this commandment, from the same list as prohibitions against murder and theft, is treated as optional. Don't call anyone a fool. Matthew 5:22 is blunt. Jesus says that calling someone a fool puts a person in danger of hellfire. The verse escalates in 3 stages. Being angry with someone brings judgment, calling someone raka, an Aramaic insult meaning something close to empty-headed, brings them before the council, and calling someone a fool puts you in danger of the fire of hell. The Greek word used is moros, the root of the English word moron. Jesus is placing verbal contempt on the same moral continuum as murder, which he addresses in the verse immediately before. The word fool is used casually billions of times daily in conversation, online, in comedy, in music, often by people who would be horrified to be told they were violating a direct statement from Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount consistently internalized external laws into thought and speech, and this is one of its sharpest examples. Give to everyone who asks. Matthew 5:42 states it plainly. Give to everyone who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Luke 6:35 intensifies it, instructing believers to lend without expecting anything back. These are not qualified commands. There is no clause for worthiness, no means testing, no exception for people who might misuse what they receive. Applied literally, this instruction would fundamentally reshape personal finance, property ownership, and social obligation for anyone who claims to follow it. Paired with the command to sell everything and give to the poor, these verses form a picture of radical economic generosity that Jesus returns to repeatedly across multiple gospel accounts. The distance between these instructions and the average Christian's relationship with money, savings, loans, and requests from strangers is, depending on your perspective, either a theological puzzle or the most consistently ignored teaching in the New Testament. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.